So yesterday I came in here in an attempt to make sure I had all the technology set up correctly and knew what to do. Chris met with me last week and we kind of went over it and he showed it to me. And I'm usually pretty good with technology stuff. And I was sitting here, get all hooked up and made it work correctly, and gee, I felt pretty good. Picked up this thing and pushed a little button, nothing happened. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, what's wrong? I looked at everything, checked all the connections, and it all worked right. That thing was on, the computer was on. Kept playing with it, pushing this button, come on, work, work. Nothing. Then I realized finally, much to my chagrin, on the side of it is a little on-off switch. It works a lot better when you turn it on. Ah, it does. So today's message is the calling card. And it's kind of an odd thing, something that I heard many years ago, which always stuck with me and thought about quite a bit. I think it's a pretty good message that a lot of people read the Bible but don't always understand what it says, or read the Bible enough to understand what it says. And this is a small section that I went through, and I had very much that same thought. I read this section many times, thought it was a great little story of Jesus healing somebody, but didn't realize the depth that it should have meant to people who listened to it. So before we get to it, it's based on Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. So before we get there, though, I want to go back and just take a little short look at the book of Matthew itself and why it was written and who wrote it. It was written by Matthew, or most people believe it's written by Matthew, also called Levi. He was a tax collector. He was one of the apostles of Jesus. He wrote the book primarily to prove to the Jewish people that Jesus was the Messiah. And he used, in the book of Matthew, 9 texts, the references are up here, that talks about the place that he says this proved that Jesus was the Messiah. Now you notice that verses 8, 1 through 4 are italicized. Those are not part of what the authors of the NIV Bible thought were part of the 9 texts. Those are the ones that I've put in there because I believe they also prove that Jesus is the Messiah, or helps people understand that he was the Messiah. So if you get a chance, read Matthew a little bit, look at those 9 proof texts, and understand that that's where Matthew, who was a Jewish person, he was a tax collector, probably fairly wealthy, understood the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, a great deal, and he was telling people Jesus fulfills all of these prophecies, all of these steps. And you ought to go back and the Jewish people should understand that and then acknowledge that he is the Messiah. A long time ago, kind of changed subjects a little bit, I spent 26 years in the Marine Corps, 10 years as an enlisted man and 16 years as an officer. And in my 10th year, I was selected for the Warrant Officer Program. So I had to go to the basic school to learn how to be an officer. After being 10 years in the Marine Corps, I thought I needed some training, I guess. One of the things that we had to do as an officer was buy all the uniforms. And when you're an enlisted person, they give you the uniforms, and they give you a small supplemental allowance every month to take care of them. As an officer, you buy your own uniforms, you take care of all your own uniforms. And I was thinking a couple of days ago, we spent pretty close to $2,000, I think, in uniforms. They're not cheap. One of the things you also have to buy is a little tiny calling card. All military officers have calling cards. I spoke to George this morning and verified that the Navy had them. And they're simple. All they are is your rank and your name, nothing else. And they're used for when you go to a new duty station, you report to the commanding officer, or you go to a dining in or a mess night, you present the calling card. It says what you are, rank, and who you are by name. And if you go to a dining in or a mess night, or if you have a general's officer call or a commanding officer's call and you go to the house for some reason, there'll usually be a basket or a bowl set out, and you walk up and just drop your card in the bowl, and it tells them you were there and who you were and that you were there. Very simple, very straightforward. Also very expensive. I think that we had to buy 500 of those, and they're like $2 a piece. It wasn't quite that bad, but they were pretty expensive. So next thing I want to do is take a look at our verses in Matthew, 8 through 14, chapter 8, 1 through 4. But before we do that, let's kind of surround ourselves with what the book of Matthew is like in this particular section. So just before chapter 8 starts, chapters 5 through 7 is the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus is talking about all kinds of different things and telling people what he expects, what the Lord expects, how to live. And at the very end of that, the last 2 verses of that, Jesus finishes the Sermon on the Mount, and he's coming down from the mountain. And as he's coming down from the mountain, people are saying how tremendous it was to hear him speak, to hear him teach. He spoke with such authority that he knew what he was talking about. Jesus was a fairly young man. He would have been in his late 20s, early 30s maybe at this time. He'd been trained as a carpenter. People didn't know him too much as the Lord yet, but they had heard him preach now, they'd heard him speak, and he spoke with tremendous authority. So he finishes the Sermon on the Mount, and he gets down to, and it comes into chapter 8, the first 4 verses are where he heals a man with leprosy. We're going to take a fairly close look at those 4 verses. Then after that, he heals a centurion's servant. He heals Peter's mother and several other people. He describes the cost of following Jesus to the rich man. He calms the storm and subdues the waves as he and the disciples are crossing a river. And then on the other side, he heals 2 demon-possessed men. But in the middle of this are these 4 little verses that I've read many, many times and never paid attention to, never understood the depth of what those 4 verses were. So let's take a little bit closer look at them. Now, these are the 4 verses. When Jesus came down from the mountainside, this is after the Sermon on the Mount, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came to him and knelt before him and said, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. Then Jesus said to him, "See that you don't tell anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them." A couple of things to notice here. First off, the man didn't come up and say, "Can you clean me? Will you clean me?" The man knew that Jesus could cleanse him. He said, "If you are willing, you can cleanse me." There was no question in this man's mind that Jesus could cleanse him. And he didn't say, "Heal me." He said, "Cleanse me." As a man with leprosy, and in fact, if any of you have a reference Bible of some type, you'll probably see a little note in your Bible that says the word leprosy, the Greek word leprosy, is actually a word that's used to mean many different skin ailments, not just the disease leprosy as we understand it. Because he had some type of a skin ailment, he was considered to be unclean, which meant that he couldn't participate in any of the tabernacle meetings. He couldn't participate in any of the sacrificial meetings that went on. He was basically an outcast of the Jewish people. So it was very important for the Jewish people to be cleansed so that they could then participate in all the religious ceremonies that the Jewish faith was so centered on. So he said, "You can clean me. You can make me clean." And Jesus answered and said, "I am willing. Be cleansed." And immediately the man was clean and, of course, healed at the very same time. And then the piece that always stuck in my head that took me a long time to figure out what is the bottom piece. Jesus told him, "Don't tell anybody." Am I in your way, Johnny? I'm sorry.
No.
Don't tell anybody. But go offer the gift Moses commanded as a testimony to them. 2 little sentences, relatively simple. I breezed over those for years and never paid attention to them. But what was the significance of the cleansing? Why did Jesus tell this man to show himself to the priest? So I think this was Jesus' calling card, that he was telling the priest, "I'm here. I'm the Messiah." So let's go back and let's look at the reading that we had this morning in 2 Kings 1 through 15 and pick it apart a little bit to see why they felt this. I've also added a couple of verses in here that weren't actually in the reading, so we won't go through it quite as quickly won't read every word of it, but part of it starts out that Naaman was the commander of the foreign army. Aram was the king of that army. Naaman had leprosy, and through a raid on some Jewish people, there was a Jewish servant who was working for Naaman's wife. And she came to the wife and said, "No, if Naaman would go see the prophet in Samaria, he would heal her." So Naaman thought, why not? It's worth a try. So Naaman went to the king and said, "I want to go see the prophet in Samaria to have that person heal me." And then it gets kind of interesting. This is what isn't really was not part of the reading this morning. Beginning with verse 4, Naaman went to his master and told him what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel," not to the prophet of Israel, where Naaman was told to go, but to the king of Israel. So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. The letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you so that you may cure him of his leprosy." And then look at the next couple of lines and look at what the king of Israel says. "As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his robes and said, 'Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of his leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me.'" So obviously the king of Israel realized he couldn't cure leprosy. He knew he couldn't cure leprosy. And yet he'd been given a letter from another king, a very powerful king apparently, who had said, "I'm sending this man to you to be cured." And the king of Israel obviously thought, I can't cure him, so I'm in trouble. This guy's going to attack me because I can't fulfill the wish that he wants. So what's the key here? The key is that the Jewish people, in fact, probably many people at that time, believed that only God could cure leprosy. And again, leprosy is kind of a general term meaning any kind of a skin disease. And think about it back in those days. Today, even, it's difficult to get rid of psoriasis or any of the other skin diseases that we have running around. Back in those days, it was probably impossible unless God did it for them. So most people, including the Israelis, believed that only God could cure leprosy. And look what the king of Israel says, am I God? Can I kill and bring someone back to life? They put healing leprosy on the same level as bringing someone back from the dead. See how the man is trying to pick a quarrel with me. So it looks like this man is trying to deliberately pick a fight so he could attack Israel and take over that country. They believed it so much that in the book of Moses, the law of Moses is actually a command that says there's an offering for it. And if you want to go sometime and look at it, it's in Leviticus chapter 14, verses 2 through 32, which lists the offering for being healed of leprosy. Fairly long process, a couple of different types of offerings, and depending on what that offering is, the priest has to prepare it in a certain way and do certain things with it. But it's there. So it really shows that the only way a person could be healed from leprosy is if God healed leprosy. So let's go to the rest of the story. So when Elijah heard that Naaman had come to the king of Israel, and the king of Israel had gotten angry, but it goes on, when Elijah, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message. Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel. So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elijah's house. Elijah sent a messenger to him to say to him, go, wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed. But Naaman went away angry, and he said, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand over and call on the name of the Lord, his God, wave his hand over the spot, and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than any of the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed? So he turned and went away off in a rage. And which one of us wouldn't do the same thing? You're expecting something great, and this guy comes up, a servant comes up and says, just go wash yourself in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be taken care of. Typical of us to respond in such a way that Naaman did. But fortunately, he has a smart little servant who basically went back to him and said, what do you got to lose? Go dip yourself in the river 7 times and see what happens. You got nothing to lose. And as the rest of it says, Naaman's servant went to him and said, my father, if the prophet had told you to do some great things, would you not have done it? How much more then when he tells you, wash and be cleansed? So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times, as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored, and became clean like that of a young boy. Then Naaman and all his attendants went back to the man of God. He stood before him and said, now I know that there is no God in all the world except in Israel. And it's important, a couple things important to note here. First off, Elijah did not heal Naaman. Elijah didn't even talk to him, didn't even see him. He just said, go wash in the Jordan River 7 times and you'll be cleansed. So obviously it was God that cleansed Naaman. Many people washed every day in the Jordan River. None of them were cleansed of leprosy. But Naaman was, because he came deliberately to Israel to be cleansed. He was told he would be cleansed. The prophet told him, go to the river, wash 7 times, and you will be cleansed. So obviously God was the one who cleansed him. It wasn't Naaman. It wasn't Naaman himself. It wasn't Elijah the prophet. It wasn't the king of Israel. It wasn't Aram, the king of whatever country it was. It was God who cleansed Naaman. So, a little break here for a second. Do we have any teachers here today in the congregation? Any teachers? English teacher, maybe? Any English teachers? That's good. Because I really don't like English. In English, there are all kinds of rules. But every rule has an exception. Think of the vowels that we have. A, E, I, O, and U, and sometimes Y. Why not always Y? Or I before E, except after C. And even then, that doesn't work, because proper names actually have that reversed sometimes. So I'm not really much on the exceptions. And if you don't believe me, just ask Kim. She'll verify that I'm not a person who doesn't likes breaks in the rules. I do like math, because math has lots of rules, but all the rules apply all the time. It doesn't make any difference what it is, they all apply. And one of the earliest rules that all of us learned was a very simple one. If A equals B and B equals C, then A must also equal C. Very simple. And there's no question about it. It works out very well. So let's apply that rule to what we just read in Matthew and 2 Kings. A, only God can cure leprosy. B, Jesus cured leprosy. Then C, Jesus must be God, the Messiah. And in fact, the Jewish people believed it so much, they have an offering specifically for a person who's cured of leprosy. And he presented this, Jesus said this, Jesus cleansed the man of leprosy, told him to go to the priest and offer the offering for it, and we don't know what happened from that point in time on. So if Jesus had a calling card, this would have been his calling card. Messiah, Jesus, Son of God. He would have given that to the priest, and who knows what would have happened. But so in doing this simple little, like he healed the man of leprosy, sent him to the priest, Jesus was telling the priest, I am the Messiah, I'm here. So it proved who he was, what he was, and that he was here. Just like my little Marine Corps calling card proved that what I was, my rank, who I was, and I'd been someplace. Jesus' calling card, what he was, who he was, and he had been there, was given to the priest. So let's look at the upper and lower story behind this, as we've been going through with Pastor Chris recently. The upper story was obviously the man with leprosy. He didn't come out and say, can you cure me, or could you cure me? He came out and said, if you're willing, you can cure me. He believed, going in, that Jesus could cure him with no problem at all. And I may be a little bit biased here against the priests, as I have them in the lower story. We don't know what happened from what the Bible tells us at this point in time. We don't know if the man actually went to the priest. We don't know if the priest did anything. There's nothing else is said about the priest. We know in general that most priests didn't accept Jesus as the Savior. And that eventually they caused him to be crucified. We don't know what the specific priest did, but in general, most of the priests were pretty much lower story. Jesus didn't show up riding golden horses and on a lightning bolt, so they weren't going to believe that he was the Messiah. So they lived in the lower story most of the time. And then there's the so what to this. And this is what always struck me as I thought about this. There are two things that I think that we need to take away from something along this line. The first one is we need to study the Word of God. And I don't mean just read it. I read the Word of God for many years. I grew up in 2 different Christian homes. My stepfather was and is a minister. My father was a very devout man who read the Bible every day, studied the Bible every day. So I was in the tune of knowing and reading the Bible, but I never really studied the Bible. Never studied it like I would for an exam. And we should, because things like this, the relationship between different parts of the Bible, the detailed, in-depth meaning of some very small, maybe even innocuous-seeming things are there. And we need to study those things and understand them, ask questions, to learn more about it. And the second one is, and this has happened to me many times, people, when I'm witnessing to them, will come up and say, well, why didn't Jesus just give a sign? Why didn't he prove that he was God? Why didn't he move a mountain or something along that line? Talk out of a burning tree or something. And for years, it kind of stumped me. Why didn't he? And then when I finally figured out what this was about and heard about this, I knew he did give signs. He gave signs the Jewish people should have known and understood and should have accepted. But for whatever reasons, they didn't. But he did give the signs. So now when someone asks that question, you can say, he did give a sign. And it's one that the Jewish priest should have known and recognized and acted on, but for whatever reason they didn't. And there's one more thing that I want to point out. One last thing. When I was talking to Chris about this, I wanted to go through this briefly with him to make sure that it was all right, it was in the line of the things that he wanted me to do, and make sure that I had my thoughts in line. And he said, there's one more thing, and that's that the healing of Naaman, who was a Gentile, God healing him is a foretaste of the fact that God's love, mercy, forgiveness, all of his pleasure in us and love in us wasn't just reserved for the Jewish people, that it was eventually going to be given to all the people, not just the Jewish people.